Right now, when you look foreign policy wise at what is easily the biggest threat to the UK, it's not what's going on in the Middle East. Yes, of course, that will be important. It will certainly affect a lot of, supply chains, but it's not going to have ultimately long term too many bad effects. Not really too many bad effects here on the UK. However, long term, bigger problems, far more supply chain problems have been caused, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've also got to look politically. You have had across Europe a rising far right that is saying, oh, it's okay. Just let, you know, just let Putin have that land, and basically appease Putin and saying, you should not be supporting Ukraine. There, yeah, that is very, very worrying. A lot of these people, a lot of those far right parties in Europe that have won, especially the Austrian one that won recently, um, yeah, very, very pro Putin. And once again, would not surprise me if a lot of these parties were getting funding, you know, probably from some, shady Russian source. Look how far Marie Le Pen went to extreme lengths to try and distance herself from Putin. Yet, still, I think would gladly run back to shake his hand at the first opportunity. So, there is a serious problem of Western support for Ukraine failing, especially in Europe. And it is a massive problem if, countries in the West do not realize that that's that's a very big problem. Because one of the big things that a lot of people have said, well, you're showing that actually, if you're Vladimir Putin, you can go and you can take territory if you're willing to face, I don't know, 2 to 3 years of sanctions. The fallout of potentially what happens next year, and I think next year is going to be a big key year for what goes on in Ukraine. We're already hearing talks that there are going to be some sort of peace talks. I've said many, many times. Um, America, us, the rest of the world should, the rest of these countries should not be negotiating for Ukraine. Ukraine should be negotiating for itself, but we should be in the room basically as backup for Ukraine. I have repeated this many, many times. If you listen to what the Ukrainians have said multiple times, they want future guarantees. This isn't going to happen again. They do not want to have to fight this war again in 10 years' time. And the worrying that the worst outcome really for me for the West, ignore Ukraine for the moment, but the worst outcome for the West, or at least for Europe, would be that we did not really support or give Ukraine all the support it needed when it needed it. So it could have seen off Putin, which now creates problems and potentially further conflicts down the line with Putin. That, for the West, at least for Europe, is potentially going to be the biggest tragedy if that turns out to be true. And unfortunately, we're going to have a look at a piece today in The Guardian. That seems to be the direction we are heading in. And that needs to be, it's again, stressed a lot. A lot that going this direction is going to be very, very bad. Not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe. It will have wider implications on a lot of different things around the world. We've talked about this about Kim Jong-un saying, the only way, you can get a united Korea is through war. There's still, of course, the possibility of then does this then embolden China to then go after Taiwan? That will cause a whole other heap of issues. So bear in mind consequences. And I do worry maybe 10, 15, 20 years, maybe we end up looking back through other things that have happened and gone, because we did not act in this way, this led to this further down the line. This had further consequences. And that is ultimately very, very worrying, especially for all of us who live in Europe. Um, but there you go. So anyway, we're going to go over and cover this because I think this is well worth going over. So this is from The Guardian, and it's the West support for Ukraine is failing, so it's fading, and that will, of course, empower Putin for his next war. That's the big worrying thing because there's a lot of targets for Putin to go after, especially Georgia. Georgia, I think, could very, very easily be the next target for Russia. So, in the corridors of Brussels, there is now a sinking feeling that the political will to help Ukraine prevail over Russian aggression is now ebbing. On both sides of the Atlantic, one senior Western official told me that it may take a quote second shock of the magnitude of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 to once again jolt Western countries out of their funk and spur Europeans on to take more radical steps to boost and integrate their own defenses. This is what we've been talking about a lot on this. So that shock may involve a sudden collapse of now the Ukrainian frontline defenses, another Bucha-style massacre by Russian forces, or even perhaps a victory for Donald Trump on the 5th of November. Any of those would be a disaster for Kyiv. And yet that should not be the case. It should not take like a collapse of Ukrainian front line, another Bucha style again. If that happened, that would result in potentially another Bucha style massacre by Russian forces. Victory for Donald Trump would absolutely cement, European needs to really look to our defensive needs, but that really should not be the case. We should have already learned the lessons, not just of February 22, but go all the way back to when Russia first annexed Crimea. And yet this is once again how Putin keeps on getting away with this stuff. And next time, who knows what could very well happen on this. It's so worrying. It is. There's a lot of really bad consequences that can come of this. And the big one is Putin goes, well, I did this in Ukraine. What's to stop me doing this elsewhere? So at least for now, the US is preoccupied with its presidential election and, of course, the escalating war in the Middle East that has now pushed Moscow's grinding advance on the Donbass fields out of the headlines. France, of course, is distracted by its own political and financial crisis, while Emmanuel Macron's power at home and influence in Europe is waning fast. Germany is, of course, paralyzed by feuding now in its own moribund three-party coalition, which may or may not stagger on until a general election now due in September of 2025. The UK is currently struggling with its own budget woes as the new Labour government focus on now repairing health and public services amid a media foray over dodgy gifts from political donors. Meanwhile, far-right and pro-Russian parties are now gaining ground in many European elections, most recently in Austria. Russia conquered more Ukrainian in territory in September than any month since March of 2022. Yet, despite Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to the UN General Assembly and Washington to present a victory plan, and of course plead for more weapons and a freer hand to use them on Russian soil, American and European attention has now drifted away. To Kiev, these are very, very dangerous and very frustrating times. And I agree. It's incredibly frustrating. And I do not know what it must be like for, for people in Ukraine at the moment itself. But what happens next Very, very worrying. And I will admit, I went into, a couple of months ago feeling very, very optimistic. However, that situation on the battlefield, again, I think it just goes to show you, war can be, very dynamic. It can change almost in a flick of a switch. A couple of months ago, really sort of the beginning of the summer, I was very, very optimistic, very, very optimistic. However, things on the situation on the battlefield have changed fundamentally. I am not that optimistic as I once was. But one of the things that we really need to do is give them a free hand to use those weapons so they can strike deeper into Russian soil. That is once again where we will see some big changes if we can allow, if we allow Ukraine to sort of do that. And time again, I'll repeat this: when we've given them permission, we've given them those weapons. Guess what? They've put that to good use, and that has resulted in tactical and strategic victories for them on the battlefield. How come that lesson has not sunk in? Yeah, frustrating beyond all words. That still has not sunk in. Joe Biden is now, of course, an increasingly lame duck, and he's trying to avoid any political step that could compromise Kamala Harris's chances out of keeping Trump out of the White House. Again, very true. We talked about this. Biden at the moment is an absolute lame duck, and that is ultimately a big reason why Netanyahu is, as we've said before, pretty much pantsed Joe Biden on the UN stage a couple of weeks ago, saying, "Oh yeah, we'll go for this ceasefire," invading Lebanon. you know, and yet, what has Biden done? He's done nothing because he daren't risk Kamala Harris's chances. Because if Trump gets in, then things in the Middle East are going to get a whole lot worse. Say what you will about how bad Joe Biden has handled this situation in the Middle East. If Trump gets in and he handles it, things could get infinitely worse. Infinitely worse. So, this obviously constrains not only his ability to now reign in Israel in its battle with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, but also now his willingness to now authorize Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with US supplied weapons or even European arms containing US components, which again, big thing here, which is one of the big things that is coming down to the Storm Shadow stuff. Storm Shadows, joint French UK development on them that use US components, and it is US that has stopped us doing that. There is a very much a lesson to be learned here. We've talked before about rebuilding capacity, making sure that we have those, supplies so that we aren't then dependent on the US if this situation ever happens again. So a lot of lessons really, really need to be learned. Really need to be learned. And it worries me that we are not learning these lessons. Really worries me we are not learning these lessons. So back to this. So obviously Biden does remain very concerned that Vladimir Putin may raise the nuclear stakes or even retaliate against the West in the ways that could now widen the conflict and, of course, hand Trump now a propaganda stick to which to beat the Democrats. Again, biggest problem here. Till November elections, it's, super worrying. Anyway, back to this. So France and Britain, of course, which do supply Ukraine with Storm Shadows and, of course, Scalp air-to-ground missiles, cannot permit their unrestricted use against Russia in the Russian rear or even bases without now a US green light. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz continues to balk, of course, at supplying the Taurus missile system, which Kyiv has long requested to target Russian supply lines and, of course, missile launch pads. Scholz's reluctance is now a mixture of electoralism, with the Alternative for Deutschland and Sarah Waldkirch alliance are both very anti-war. Historical, of course, these SDB parties have always been the party of peace, but they do fear that signaling out Germany now for Russian retribution. once again, what do what's these parties? I generally don't know what their plan is. For this, what is you know you know the Deutschland Party or the Sarah Volkach or the Wagner Alliance? Oh yeah, you're both anti-war, but by that very own stance, you're almost encouraging more war to break out. And I know this is a very bizarre thing to say, to be so anti-war that you, in many ways, are encouraging war. But that's what a lot of stances. That's what a lot of we've seen throughout this war. It's what a lot of we have seen of people just saying, "I am so anti-war," but they're not even considering the implications for their stance in this. It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind, and we have a lot of lessons, not only just for us here in the UK, but for all of Europe, really, to learn the lessons of this conflict. Because I worry this could have further implications down the line, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe as well. Very, very much so. So, in, of course, is now parting speeches and interviews. The former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg expressed his now very public regret that the Western allies had not supplied Ukraine with more weapons before Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion, arguing that it would have made Moscow's offensive a lot harder and maybe even deterred it. But this is, of course, 2020 hindsight. Again, very true. But regardless of what happens, maybe we learn this. Maybe, of course, as we've seen, Rheinmetall saying they're going to set up factories in Ukraine as well to help bolster, Ukraine's own military, its own military capacity, its own military equipment. Maybe we have to do the same, not only to help Ukraine build up its own armed forces as well by sending them weapons, but also, as I've said many, many times before, increasing our own military capacity here as well. Hugely, hugely important move we have to seriously consider on that. So, especially, of course, since Stoltenberg is still very unwilling to condemn US caution or even press openly now for releasing deep strike capabilities. The retired US Major General Gordon Skip David lamented that Biden administration has now delayed time and time again. Speaking on a European Policy Center panel now on the battleground situation in Ukraine, he said that the Washington now had overestimated the likelihood that Putin would escalate the conflict and hence continue to provide just enough to keep Kiev's head above the water while without withholding the means to prevail. We will not as long as it takes, but is whatever it takes, David said. EU officials do see very much a parallel between the reluctance to provide a genuine game-changing assistance to Ukraine and, of course, the very stubborn resistance amongst major European powers against collective borrowing and joint weapons purchases to boost Ukraine's and their own defenses. This is something that could happen here. This is absolutely right. There is a very, very good argument for European powers getting together, engaging in collective borrowing, joint weapons purchases, looking at going, okay, what European rather than American firms do we need to improve on so that we have that capability here, so that we don't have to rely, in the future for US approval to use our own missiles. There's so much stuff we need to really learn on this. Really fundamentally need to learn, and I hope we learn those lessons, because if not, we may find a lot of these problems be repeated again in the future. So many European countries have also now emptied their own threadbare ammunition stocks to help supply Ukraine, and of course are now very much struggling to expand their own national arms industries or even supply sources abroad. And again, fundamentally, this has been an issue all this war right at the start. A big, you know, scandal in Germany that Germany had like 2 days worth of shells, artillery shells. We've just had probably, I think it was you know, generic Jerick say at the Conservative Party conference that, oh yes, the UK doesn't have enough shells. So, thank you for, spilling national secrets there. But they are right. He is right. We do need to re-expand our own national arms industries. This is something not only the UK really needs to look at, but all of, Europe as well. Hence why a collective European defense agreements need to be seriously looked at. Like, seriously, all of them need to be like fundamentally looked at once again and thought, you know, particularly, of course, the threat of like Donald Trump and the whole thing at the start of this. Are we going to be in a situation where America doesn't come to our defense? You know, that was a serious conversation. Many people, and we are still technically having to have that conversation until the election is done and over. But it is still a very serious concern. But doing that, re-expanding our own sort of national sort of arms industries, getting supply sources sorted out would be a very, very good economic move. I mean, one way to encourage growth might not be a lot of growth people would like, but hey, sometimes you've got to prepare. So there was, of course, very much some momentum behind now a great European defense integration earlier this year when the Commission published its own defense industrial strategy. A senior official told me, but that has obviously now faded since the European elections, with the political problems now in key capitals. Now it may take an earthquake, as such now as the return to power of a NATO skeptical Trump, to renew this energy and to put more money behind the EU defense efforts. If Harris wins, the risk is that the EU capitals will then ease up and revert to relying on US protection, as some did after the Biden defeat of Trump in 2020. Again, we cannot rely. We, this is again one of the big lessons. We cannot now rely on permanent US protection, but that has been almost a fundamental building block of European country defense spending and strategy, that there was that US protection if that happened. But now you've got, if not one of the biggest wars happening in the world since World War II, in our in our backyard for many ways. Where's the US protection really been on this? Fundamentally, it's just really not been there. And this should have been a massive wake-up call to maybe what could happen, because okay, maybe Harris wins, but who wins next time? And what if this happens under a Trump-like figure in the future? You know, what will happen? But back to this. So Ukraine can, of course, ill afford now to wait for such a second shock as a jolt to Western governments, as its forces now being bled out daily in this now war of attrition imposed by a bigger enemy. You can't expect Ukraine to sustain another 30 months when our own country is now the battlefield and subjected to daily strikes. Molga Belinsky, a senior analyst at the Ukrainian National Institute for Strategic Studies, said at this very same EPC panel. He said, "What we don't see is, of course, a long-term strategy for sustained support. Otherwise, the Russian victory scenario will progress. The European governments, regardless of the domestic predicaments, the choice ought to be very clear. Support Ukraine more decisively now, including with deep strike capabilities, or face a far worse strategic proposition next year with an emboldened Putin rearming for his next war of conquest." And that is something we will see. We have seen the Russian spending on military stuff explode. Like, Russian military spending right now is, hang on, let me look this up for you. Yep. So there has been an increase in Russian military budget spending. They've increased it by 25%, which now accounts for 40% of Russia's GDP is now going on military spending. Like 40% of their GDP is now on military spending. You tell me who's taking this war seriously. And of course, that's not going to fall after this war, because that is right. Putin will rearm. And then where will he go? Or if you've got this bigger army now, why not go to Georgia? After all, Georgia is another country that Putin considers to be, Russia. And they aren't doing, all the things he wants them to do either. Also pursuing, European integration, NATO protection as well. And what happens to Ukraine in all this? There's huge fundamental questions. And we should be really, really worrying, um, about what happened in the future, not only just for the rest of Europe, but for Ukraine as well, and potentially what Putin will do next. Because Putin's not going to stop. There will be another war. Putin will start another war. That's inevitable. It's just where. And there's been a lot of people have said it now. What if Putin decides to test the NATO alliance, not by fully invading a country, but by just taking a border town? Will a Sarah Volknik, I don't know whatever the full pronunciation of the German name is, if she was chancellor, would she commit to Article 5 if it was just a border town? Kind of, because once you trigger Article 5 and then countries don't respond, you've sort of broken NATO fundamentally broken NATO and the promise of what it was and what it should be doing. So there is a lot of fundamental questions that we really have to do. And I would hope that the UK learns a lot of lessons, because we need to really learn a lot of these lessons for the future to make sure a lot of this stuff doesn't happen again. Maybe as being too reliant on America is a very bad thing, when maybe we should be considering a new military alliance with us, France, and Germany. There are fundamental questions that need to be asked and should be addressed, and it's terrifying that we do not see these questions being fundamentally addressed or asked. So, yeah, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.